Thank you all for waiting. There were some logistical problems of fitting everybody in, but it's a very good turnout, so thank you all for making the time to come this evening. My name is Jeroen Gunning. I'm a professor of Middle East politics and conflict studies at the other place across the road. But I'm also a visiting professor here at the Middle East Center, so I have a bona fide claim to being in this chair. What we're going to do tonight is Jerome, and I will introduce Jerome a little bit more in detail. He's a senior analyst on Jihad and Modern Conflict at the International Crisis Group. He received his PhD from Durham University, where I had the privilege of being his supervisor, and I learned a lot from him over the years, also since then. He has conducted extensive field research in conflict zones, including Syria, of course. He has interviewed hundreds of Jihadi militants and foreign fighters, from their military, political, and religious leaders to their foot soldiers, so it's a very kind of anthropological kind of range, to gain a deeper understanding of their changing political views in armed conflicts. And he also told me that there's a kind of a follow-up book on the book tonight, which you really should be looking out for, which is called Transformed by the People. And this is a more anthropological study of the same groups with Patrick Henney. So do look out for that. Then IHEID is a Syrian columnist and a consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Previously, IHEID was a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, where I also had the privilege of being his teacher at the master's course there. He also worked as a program manager on Syria and Iraq at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Middle East office in Beirut. And has previously worked as a senior community services protection assistant at the UNHCR's Damascus office. IHEID's main research interests include security policies, governance, conflict resolution, and non-state actors. And then finally, Rayhan Ismail is His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford. Rayhan's research interests include political Islam, sectarianism, and the intertwining nature of religion and politics in the Middle East. She has written in academic and non-academic outlets, including the Washington Post's Monkey Cage publication, which I think rates much higher than any academic publication. She's the author of Saudi Clerics and Shia Islam with Oxford University Press, and Rethinking Salafism, the transnational networks of Salafi ulama in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, also with Oxford University Press. So without further ado, Jerome, please take the floor.
Hi, hello everyone, thank you for coming. I will try to be quite concise so that then we have more time as well for questions and response. So, what about this research? You've probably all seen what has happened for the past month and a half or so, with a coalition of armed groups led by a former Jihadi group that was initially affiliated with Islamic State in Iraq, later with Al-Qaeda, that very quickly took over all of Syria, and now they are becoming the new government, having meetings with foreign diplomats, from countries from the Arab world, from Western countries, and so on. So this book is basically how did we come to this point. So first, why did this group and a few of its allies came to dominate the armed opposition to the Syrian regime? And second, how did they change also politically in the course of the conflict? Because they're not just changing for the past few weeks, but there is a much longer process at stake. So it's about explaining these two things. The book is called From Jihad to Politics. You can access it online. It's available for free. You can download the PDF. It's based on extensive field research, initially undertaken in Turkey with some of the commanders of Syrian armed groups that were traveling back and forth to Syria, but also based on field research that we've conducted myself with a few colleagues from Crisis Group, but also from Humanitarian Dialogue, a mediation organization based in Geneva, based on some understanding that we had with the HTS that we could travel several times a year to the Idlib province for the past 5 years to understand their views and their transformation as it was occurring. So, how did we get there? You've probably remembered that for the past 15 years there has been a plethora of armed groups active in Syria. Those groups, they probably numbered at some point a few hundred, possibly a few thousands, depending on how you count them. So there are obvious questions about it. First, why did so-called jihadis, so those more militant Islamists that initially were willing to fight Muslim regimes, not implementing their vision of Islamic law, and fighting at times also Western countries for supporting them, why did they take the lead of the armed opposition, while other groups, including those linked to the Free Syrian Army, actually received more support from outside actors, including Western countries and the US in particular? Second, why did the most prominent groups, so initially IHEID al-Islamiyah and then Jabhat al-Nusra, why did they politicize? Why did they change their political views rather than seeing the implementation of some of the things that they actually believed in, including in how they understand Islamic law, how we should rule society, and so on. So, when we look at the Syrian conflict, often we've seen that type of representations of the Syrian armed opposition. So basically, those were common representations of how to understand the diversity of the opposition. You had jihadis, either large groups or like small groups of foreign fighters, more nationalist rebels, some Islamist rebels, some more local factions, and so on. That was a very common way during the course of the Syrian conflict to separate different types of groups. But what I'm arguing is that this is not sufficient. This tells you something about these groups and their views, which has some relevance. But if you want to understand how they evolve, how they transform, this is not sufficient. Just to focus on what their proclaimed ideas are. What we have to focus on is armed groups as groups. Ultimately, even though they use weapons, they are political groups trying to accomplish political objectives. Through violence, but still as any of the political entities would do so. And what I'm arguing is it's not sufficient to have specific ideas. What matters really during a conflict in order to survive is to institutionalize. And that happens internally or externally. So internally, you cannot just be depending on one leader to whom you have an allegiance and then conduct your own activities. You need to actually institutionalize internally as an armed group. So that means you establish a bureaucracy. You have potentially some court of justice to judge your soldiers, but also to potentially provide some judgments outside in the population. You have to understand how to share power between different factions within your group. Who is going to make decisions, how are resources allocated, and so on. So that's internally. Externally, you have to also deal with other actors. Other actors include the plethora of armed groups that are evolving side by side with your soldiers. They include foreign countries, some of whom are opposed to you, but some of whom also are providing some support to you, either military, political, or potentially even financial. And what I'm arguing is those two dimensions explain the trajectory of armed groups in armed conflict. If you can't institutionalize internally or externally, you're basically disappearing or becoming bandits. If, like most of the groups affiliated to the Free Syrian Army, you institutionalize your relations to other actors, like foreign states or local communities and so on, you manage to survive. But without internal institutions, nothing remains of you as a group, as an entity. So what remains is, once you institutionalize internally, you can either radicalize or politicize. And that depends on the type of relations that you have with other actors, with other groups, with the population, with the foreign states. And politicizing is particularly difficult to achieve. So what HTS now has achieved, because you have to balance internal pressure and external pressure. You know, for example, sometimes you make concessions to other states, concessions to the population by not implementing fully what you stand for, but that might be opposed by some of your internal commanders and so on, who might be more committed than you are. So there is a balancing act, basically, in maintaining your internal and external relations. And if you want to understand why jihadis took over the lead of the opposition, you have to understand not what happened only in 2011, but what happened before. When you create an armed group, what precedes the creation of an armed group is very important. What are the networks on which you are going to rely upon? What exists in civil society? Are there political parties? Are there associations? Are there other types of organizations that you can transform to recruit, to mobilize, and so on? And if we look at the Syrian regime and the structure of the Syrian regime, there was little to no civil society or developed civil society before 2011, which means that when people started to respond to the repression of the popular protests, who are you going to rely upon? Most groups relied upon their immediate environment. they rely upon their families, their friends, and so on, because you have a sufficient level of trust, of shared understanding of what you can achieve together. You don't fear as much that they're going to betray you, and so on. This largely explains why the position was very localized throughout the course of the conflict. The main example that I'm using in the book is IHEID, the group that became very dominant throughout the conflict up to 2016-17, when it was gradually marginalized by HTS, and I will come back on that later on. IHEID very quickly became one of the dominant actors in the Syrian conflict. And what I explain is this success is not only because they were jihadis or committed or they had specific set of ideas. What explains it is what preceded. Many people who created IHEID also created different factions throughout the country in a very localized manner, through their friends, communities, and so on. But they also knew one another, because there was, in Syria, despite repression of civil society, there were people who were already committed in the 2000s. They had underground networks. They would speak to one another in private settings. They would train themselves. They would even indoctrinate themselves on certain texts, certain authors, certain militant jihadis, and so on. Some of them participated to the war in Iraq, but not all of them did. Some of them also were jailed by the regime and freed after 2011, 2012. So when all the groups popped up throughout Syria, the people who created IHEID similarly created different brigades around them, but they also had these pre-existing connections, which allowed them to very quickly build trust with one another, build some type of organizational umbrella that gradually institutionalized and became the foundation of a much larger and quite well-organized group. And that very much contrasts with the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, that never had that. Groups of foreign fighters who came from abroad who didn't have much connections inside, but also Jabhat and Nusra, which initially relied on more trusted connections. So they would recruit in a more individual manner as opposed to recruiting pre-existing factions. And that explains why jihadis, so IHEID, but also then also Jabhat al-Nusra and Islamic State at the time, managed to have different groups throughout Syria, because by 2013-14, Syria was divided. You didn't have only one region under the control of the opposition. So only those groups that had pre-existing networks managed to actually reach out between one another and create some lasting organizations throughout the country. Now I'm going to, because we just have 5 minutes more, to go to the difference between Jabhat al-Nusra and IHEID, but also how Jabhat al-Nusra then transformed into IHEID. So Jabhat al-Nusra initially started as a more secretive network. By 2012, there were only a much more limited number of individuals, because they didn't have the space initially to become a large organization. But ultimately, they followed basically the example of IHEID. They also became a much wider group, broadening their recruitment, trying to create more internal institutionalization the way IHEID did. But they did more with a stronger ideological component and also much more internal control. So ultimately what happened by 2016-17, two groups started to contend for the leadership of the armed opposition, IHEID and HTS by then, which ultimately ended up with a victory of HTS, which was much more cohesive, which was much more also willing to impose itself on IHEID. But ultimately, HTS similarly recognized that they had to also deal with the external environment. They had to reach out to foreign countries. They had to reach out to Turkey, even though they opposed it in the past. They had to nurture new strategic relations with regional actors, even though it was difficult because they were still listed as a terrorist organization by most foreign countries. Internally, they marginalized most of the more Ardan commanders that did not accept the direction, because they used their monopoly or the quasi-monopoly that they imposed, that they reached over governance of the province of Idlib in the northwest of the country to basically impose themselves, which allowed them to also impose more internal control over their commanders, religious scholars that might have disagreed with their positions, and so on. So for the past 5 years, they systematically tried to consolidate their governance. Their idea before the takeover of Damascus was that the regime could not win. What they had to do in the meantime was to consolidate internal governance, to create an alternative to the regime that ultimately, when balance of power changed, could take over the regime. So the last meter offensive was not supposed to reach Damascus. They thought we can reach some of the cities around Idlib, Marat Norman, Saraqib, and so on. Maybe at some point we can reach Aleppo, but reaching out to Damascus was not really expected. But somehow the victory that they have achieved largely reflects the balance of power that had been changing for the past 5 years, in which the armed opposition was becoming more consolidated, more professional, trying to reach out to external countries, sending messages, that they could be also normalized political actors and so on, while the regime had failed to reform itself. It had failed to even reach out to part of the opposition, and it was also failing internationally, despite talks about normalization with our countries and so on. It was not willing to make concessions and to create a new political pathway with the opposition. And so that very quickly ended up with the ultimate takeover of HTS. And so that was what we had just before, the takeover of Damascus. I think we are reaching the end of the 15 minutes.
You say 2 more minutes?
Okay. So, the book basically concludes in saying, when we speak about jihadis up to 2010 were quite united. There were maybe some differences between them, but what they saw was that there was an alignment between fighting local regimes and fighting Western countries. They thought that it was not incompatible. You could fight local regimes in the Gulf, for example, and fight the US, because the idea is you can't take over local regimes as long as the US support them. But 2011 totally changed that. In 2011, what they realized is that there started to be a tension. The US and Western countries stopped opposing violent change in the Muslim world, and that was obvious in Libya and Syria. And so what they understood is that you had to actually disconnect those two fights, because you could actually be fighting your regime, and maybe the US would be somehow on your side. And that has totally divided them. Too often we focus on their theology, ideological commitments, and so on, but those ultimately are the product of circumstances. And so when circumstances change, those actors are also changing. And so what we have are actually 3 pathways. The first one is IS, Islamic State, saying all of the others are infidels. All the other Islamist groups, jihadi groups, and so on, they're all infidels. Only we are the legitimate caliphate. And they launch war against against countries, against other groups, and so on. This can work to some extent because harsh violence works, but it can never work politically because they can never transform it into a political victory in which they're going to be victorious for a long time. They can destabilize some countries, they can take over some territory, but ultimately if they become too big, it creates such a pushback by the international community that they get destroyed, which is what happened in Iraq and Syria. That's the first pathway. The second pathway is Al-Qaeda. They still believe you have to fight Western countries, regardless of all these international changes and changing support for the rebellion in Libya and Syria and so on. But there's a contradiction between their objectives, between their strategy and what they stand for. In the sense, their strategy is to say, you have to fight Western countries, and once Western countries get weakened, then you can create Muslim states, or their views of an Islamic state. While the exact opposite is true. You can actually create local Islamic states, to some extent, in a vision that might differ from Al-Qaeda, but still local Islamic state, like in Syria, for example, or in Afghanistan, if you're not affiliated to Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda's existence contradicts its trajectory, its strategy. Because it's only by not being Al-Qaeda that it can be accepted by the international community to some extent. And the last path is basically what HTS and Ahmed before have achieved, saying we distance ourselves from more radical movements, we try to engage with our environment as political actors, and maybe we can find a way out. And this is what now HTS, as the new government of Syria, is trying to achieve, meeting with ministers of a range of countries, trying to lift sanctions, trying to lift their own terrorist listing internationally, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. That was exemplary in keeping to the time. Thank you very much. IHEID.
Well, thank you for having me. Let me start. I was actually planning to talk mostly about what happens after you take power. But before that, I want to reflect a bit on what Jerome just said. My PhD also focused on radical groups, in particular Hayat Tahrir Sham. And the question I try to answer is why Hayat Tahrir Sham, which started as a radical group, was more successful not only when compared to other radical groups, but also to more moderate popular groups like the Free Syrian Army groups in Syria. And the rest, basically, the ultimate answer, if we're not basically summarize it in one word, it's pragmatism. Because of that, I want to highlight few issues here. One of them is, for sure, building institutions is important for any movement. However, it's not the only sort of condition that is needed for that movement to, and in my opinion, might not be also the most relevant one. And in this case, at least, when you compare, for example, the two groups you focus on, Ahrar al-Sham and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Ahrar al-Sham started as a more organized group. From the beginning, had a clear objective. They had a governance model. They started building their institutions, and they started actually governing many areas. In comparison, Jabhat al-Nusra, which basically the former name of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, when it started, it intentionally presented itself as an elite fighting group that is not interested in governing the areas. They are only there to help people and fight for basically on their behalf and fight against the regime. And because of that, they were able to become more popular, while other groups were seen as some sort of opportunistic when it comes to some, or groups who have failed to basically deliver on the promises, despite the fact they had the ability to run the areas like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, like Ahrar al-Sham. Later on, then the group slowly started building institutions. But I think going back to the initial argument is that pragmatism was always utilized whenever needed. However, it's always coupled with force as well. Using different tactics to justify their actions at different times, they were able to co-opt and defeat many of the groups throughout the years, including Ahrar al-Sham, because it was at some point their main threat to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And they were able to capture their areas, take over the resources, which then led to the establishment of the Salvation Government, which is the civilian arm of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but I think if you want to just compare it to another group in order to say why those groups, for example, were more successful than normal local armed groups, whether those are under the umbrella of the Free Syrian Army or others. The two successful sort of groups that remain until now active, apart from the regime which is now defeated, are the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in northwest Syria. And both of them, if you look at, despite the ideological differences, there are many similarities. One of them is that both of them come with clear vision, clear ideology, hierarchy, and discipline, as well as experience and external resources. This applies to both of them. Also, what both of them share, apart from having discipline and the use of force against others who basically disagree with them. And that has allowed them to basically capture many of the areas that were at different times under the control of others. I'll come back to that during the discussion. Let's go back to what I was trying to say before. So what happens when a group like that takes over and then becomes now the de facto leader of the transition in Syria? The group has continued with the same sort of approach, being showing pragmatism and making sure to say the right things at the right time. This started with the capture of the big city of Aleppo at the beginning of the offensive that led to the collapse of the regime. We saw that at different levels. When it comes to the messaging that basically preceded the capture of the city, where they said we will protect civilians, including minorities, will protect state institutions, will make sure that services are provided and all of that, so they don't see them as just another group that has taken over the city, but as a group that is able to replace the group or the actor they're trying to defeat. And they actually delivered on those promises. They showed a high level of discipline. There were no incidents against civilians, including minorities, which played to their advantage when they captured other areas. Now, later on, they continued to basically repeat the same messages and expand on those messages, especially after the collapse of the regime in early December. Now they took over Damascus, went and now they are meeting, as you mentioned, with different diplomats, and the messages they have been saying are the same messages they have been hearing from those diplomats. They've been saying that we will ensure that the transition, without using the same word, will be democratic, as it will reflect the will of the people, will include those people, including the diverse sort of backgrounds of Syrian communities, and will, in a way, lead to a future that will not only provide security and stability for Syria, but for the region, which is important to address the concerns of the regional actors. Despite those messages, as well as some of them that have been sort of reflected in actions on the ground, people are still not believing what the group is saying for different reasons. One of them is related to the history of the group. They were previously affiliated with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and they have, throughout the years, basically committed also violations before they took over Idlib and became IHEID Tahrir Sham, but also the way they were governing Idlib and areas around it in northwest Syria was not done in a way that will basically give confidence to anyone, whether those locals or internationals, for many reasons. 2 minutes. One of them is, I have 2 minutes, but the other one is basically they did not allow for local participation. They were going after the people who were disagreeing with them, and most importantly, now the actions they are or the policies they're implementing right now also don't, let's say, 100% give confidence, because the caretaker authority they appointed is mostly from them, if not exclusively from their own group. So one color, one policy, and they justified that in different ways. Another thing is not only basically they're all from the same group, but also some of the decisions made by those actors and the group as a whole some of them, they go beyond just this the 3 sort of months period that they give to themselves to just manage the country until a new transitional government is established. We'll talk about that in details later on. And the last bit, which is, I think, the most important one, is related to the national dialogue that's supposed to take place in Syria soon, and will be the main sort of cornerstone that will chart the way for different issues for the country when it comes to different issues, including rewriting the constitution, talking about what sort of governance model people would want, elections, talking about also how to restructure the army, military, and security forces, and all of those key issues. But despite the importance of this conference, the group until now has not been clear about how they are trying to call for people what criteria they're using to invite the people to participate in that, what criteria they will establish or mechanisms in order to ensure that there is transparency in the discussions taking place there, but also to allow people to hold that entity and the individuals attending it accountable later on after the meeting is over. And I think now we'll end with this. It's like people are still hopeful. I was in Syria, just came back yesterday. People are hopeful because things are changing to the better in some sense. There are many goods are more available. People are more able to talk about, discuss politics, discuss their daily life, discuss even the de facto authority in Damascus right now without really being scared of what might happen, because that was privilege that people, or even a right that did not exist before. But they're still scared because they don't know if what they are seeing right now is the vision that will continue to sort of exist in Syria, maybe even be consolidated later on, which will allow the group to maintain its power for years to come, or whether the group is just struggling to overcome this period because of lack of experience, lack of manpower, and the inability to delegate and allow others to share the authority and make decisions. And I think this is one of the key issues that the group was struggling with before, as we were talking, and we continue to, and is still struggling with right now. The decisions are concentrated in the hands of few people in the group, and those people are now busier than ever. So will they be able to really trust others and allow them in and allow them to make those decisions, or will they continue to basically hold the fate of the country in their hand and basically insist that all the decisions are made by them and by them alone? The decision to those issues will, I think, will determine the future of not only the group but the country as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rehan, over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I must say, I'll be very frank, I don't work on Syria and I don't work on jihadi groups. I work on Salafism and the networks of Salafi clerics, and I thought, okay, I'm here to talk about the book, which I have read, and I think it is a fantastic book, and I would strongly recommend that people pick up this book and read it. So what I'm hoping to do is perhaps to comment on the book, but more importantly is to really praise you, to be honest. I think it's an excellent book. I mean, you've done a lot of field work.
Now I know what you brought.
Yes, you tried.
Need to balance.
Yes, I do think it's an excellent book. One thing that was really interesting for me was that that you talked about Jabhat al-Nusra in the book, or Tahrir al-Sham, previously known as Jabhat al-Nusra. And I remember while I was working on the Salafi ulama in 2013 and 2014, the Salafi clerics were divided. So they didn't know what to do with Jabhat al-Nusra. Some of them were supportive of Jabhat al-Nusra, and others were critical of Jabhat al-Nusra because of Jabhat al-Nusra's relations with ISIS. And I remember some of them saying that Jabhat al-Nusra is really different from ISIS, and therefore they got in a lot of trouble for supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. Later, some of them were arrested by their governments, but clearly it was very much contested even in 2014 and 2015. So what I would do, again, as I've said, to comment and share my thoughts on the book. This is awful. I'm just going to be praising him. But I think it is an important work that looks at the transformation of jihadi groups during the Syrian civil war. So the book, as you've mentioned earlier, asks this question: how did groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham evolve from militant jihadis to political actors? And I think you've answered this by providing or offering a compelling framework, I feel, for understanding how jihadi groups institutionalize and adapt under pressure. And as you've mentioned earlier as well, the book really explores how armed groups' trajectories are shaped by two critical factors, internal and external institutionalization. And you've really developed that quite well in your presentation, and I do think that the book makes a lot of sense in providing that framework and explaining that framework. What I would say as well, even when we, what I got from that discussion is when we talk about Islamism in general, or how we understand Islamism. And previously, when we talk about Islamism, often scholars focus on non-violent groups, or at least groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or An-Nahda Party in Tunisia. And you have almost two views. Some scholars argue that, they're wedded to their ideology. These groups will never change. They would like to implement Sharia law. They want to establish an Islamic state. That has always been part of the debate. And others take a different approach and argue that ideology is not a straitjacket, groups are pragmatic and groups change, and so on. And they look at Tunisia as an example of a non-violent Islamist group that offers something a little bit different, that's accommodating, that's very understanding when it comes to women's rights as well as minority rights and so on. And I think you take it, you're providing in many ways challenging that view as well. Even when it comes to jihadi groups. Perhaps we can also use some of the arguments that you put forward. The idea that even with jihadi groups, it cannot be as simplistic as arguing that all jihadi groups are the same. Even with jihadi groups, clearly some jihadi groups, because of the conditions, because of the circumstances that you've mentioned earlier, being in armed struggle, they're also trying to be pragmatic. They also can be pragmatic. But it goes back to your point, to what extent are they able to maintain that pragmatism, especially when they're challenged by demands to pursue their ideological considerations, that is yet to be seen, I suppose, in the context of Syria. So I know you didn't really talk about it in your presentation, but do you mind if I can draw attention to the four possible trajectories for armed groups in conflicts like in Syria, like Syria's conflict. And I think in many ways that applies to other conflicts as well. So I don't think this book is just about Syria. This book is also about understanding how groups, particularly jihadi groups, operate in other countries, particularly when you're looking at civil wars and so on. And I think you've argued that some groups fail to institutionalize at all, and these groups dissolve into irrelevance and even criminality. I think you've kind of mentioned that in your book. Other groups develop strong internal structures but reject external ties, becoming ideologically rigid and isolated. And you give ISIS as an example, where for them it's all about strong internal structures, but very much wedded to the ideology, quite violent. And therefore they sideline potential allies through extreme governance and violence. And many factions, as you've said, particularly groups with external or strong external connections, but weak internal cohesion, often fragment and become dependent on foreign sponsors. So you've mentioned the Free Syrian Army in particular, where the Free Syrian Army received funding from the Saudis as well as the Qataris and the United States, and yet they were unable to really kind of materialize as a powerful group in Syria, mainly because they have very good external connections but very weak internal cohesion. And I think in your book, the fourth successful trajectory is politicization, as you've mentioned, where groups institutionalize both internally and externally. And clearly, Ahrar al-Sham and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham represent this model. So I think one thing that I felt that makes it very interesting as well is how, do I have time?
3 more minutes.
Okay, fantastic. I'm almost done. So is the idea how groups, particularly when we talk about going back to the idea that jihadi groups are rigid, jihadi groups don't change. And I think it's really interesting how you've looked at Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as well as Ahrar al-Sham, and they rejected the transnational jihadis agenda and focus on the Syrian struggle. And perhaps I think that's again fascinating in terms of understanding jihadi ideology in general. How pragmatic are these groups? How pragmatic they can be. I know you perhaps don't like to use the word moderation, because I know sometimes the word moderation can be very much contested, and I think I'm going to stick to the word pragmatic rather than the word moderation, because I don't even know what that means, to be honest. So this book, in many, I will conclude by saying that your findings challenge conventional counterterrorism narratives. You've also argued that not all jihadi groups are destined for radicalization. Their trajectories depend on how they institutionalize internally and externally, and it also provides there's significant implications for policymakers and for conflict resolution. Do we then work with Ahrar al-Sham? Tahrir al-Sham, and you can see countries are trying to basically assess what to do with this group. And I know I was talking to one of the policymakers in the region, and he was saying that governments are often, they react to situation. They themselves are still trying to find out whether or not this is a group that they can work with. And clearly, so far, they've demonstrated that they're quite pragmatic. They are willing to consider various options as well. So perhaps maybe this is a group that might work for Syrians, or it might not. Time will tell. I will conclude. I would say that this is a very good book. It's very well written. It's a joy to read, and it's definitely a must-read for everyone.
And make sure to invite you to my book when it's out.
I get 3 invitations everywhere.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you all very much. Do you want to make any comments?
No,
let's
that's
go straight to the audience.
Questions.
Okay, then over to you. When you have a question or comment, keep it short. Comments particularly shorter than questions, and say your name and your affiliation. So I can see that the gentleman over there at the back.
My name is Caleb. I'm a former PhD student of Jeroen's and a former flatmate of Jerome's. I'll hold either of those things against me. So, Jerome, I have 2 questions for you, and also to the rest of the panel. The first one is, how cohesive would you say HTS is? HTS originally were founded out of a coalition of other groups, and to be fair, some of those are now defunct and not very relevant. But there were in Idlib issues both internally, externally within, and external to HTS. I can only imagine that that has become slightly more given recent situational developments. So could you comment on HTS's cohesion? Because pragmatism is great, but it has a point. It requires legitimacy, credibility, and opportunity. So just if you could comment a little bit on that. The second thing is, and we've spoken about this before, Jolani used to have this uncanny ability of sniffing out a threat when he was in Idlib. If it was from an armed group, or if it was politically, he managed to negotiate himself and navigate his way around some quite complex issues. What would you say now, this is expanded, are HTS's biggest threats? Or what they would consider their biggest threats? Is it Turkey and Turkish armed groups in the north? Is it Hezbollah and smuggling networks through Syria? Is it the positioning of Israel? Is it the fact that to rebuild the Syrian economy you'll need the agricultural productivity and the oil infrastructure of the northeast, which is not under their control? Is it external factors to do with Gulfi money, donors? I work in the humanitarian sector, so donor pressure in particular. What would you consider, because we all like talking about what we think HTS's biggest problems are. What would you reckon, having done this work, you would consider that they think are their biggest threats?
Shall we take
Yeah,
three questions?
yeah.
The person in the pink jacket.
My name is Jean Shaul. I'm Professor Emeritus at Manchester University. My questions relate to these groups have been funded by some of the most reactionary forces on the planet, by US imperialism, the Gulf, Turkey, and so on, to the tune of billions of dollars to unseat a pretty awful regime. It's very clear that they're part and they're pawns or proxies for US and Turkey's control in the Middle East. What I'd like to hear from the panel is, are you saying that these proxies, these agents, have any progressive role to play in Syria? Are they going to be able to alleviate the poverty, the backward conditions, and so on that afflict this country that has seen its economy just plummet to 1/10 of what it was before? So I'd like you all to, to really recognise what the place, what the position, and in whose interests are they acting? Because it's not clear to me that they're acting in the interests of ordinary people, of workers and rural masses in Syria.
Yeah, thanks very much. Eddie Sullivan, This Week in the Middle East YouTube programme. The question I want is compare and contrast 2003, which we remember well here, and 2025. In 2003, Iraq had a nationalist, secularist, authoritarian regime that was deposed by force, and that's what happened to Syria, at least by foreign arms. Syria and Iraq have many communities. In 2003, Syria's got such a situation, and in both situations, in 2003 and in 2005, there were jihadi groups in Iraq, jihadi groups in Syria. So perhaps the panel could attempt this question. What makes you think that the future of Syria in 2025 is going to be radically different, or anyway different, from what happened to Iraq in 2003? And secondly, do you think that Ahmed al-Sharaa has learned anything from Iraq's experience? Is there any evidence at all he has, apart from, if you're going to take over a country by force, have a good PR firm?
Thank you. So first, about the question of the cohesion, what you have to see is what preceded the takeover of Damascus. And basically, HTS for the past 5 years had been dealing with its own radicals, its own dissidents inside the group. Every time they had to make a concession, either a concession to Turkey, a concession to Russia, a concession to foreign countries, it created more dissidents within the group, which then allowed them to clamp down on the dissidents, and somehow only those that are remaining in the group are those who agreed with the general line that is proposed by their leader. So in that sense, cohesion has been strengthened over the years, and now Ahmed al-Sharaa is strengthened also by the fact that he has led this group to victory, which gives him also a lot of credibility within the group. So cohesion is quite strong, but there are still tensions, particularly with some groups of foreign fighters that had accepted his general line, but that might oppose now some aspects of his new governance project. So that might create some tensions, and to what extent is the group going to be able to control these tensions in an environment that's much bigger than just a small province in the northwest of the country. So that's one of the big question marks. And actually that links to the main threat. The group is a small group ultimately. There are maybe 20 to 30,000 soldiers, which is totally insufficient to control a country as large as Syria. So where the group managed to be in charge, it does impose some security, and it is quite reliable with local communities and so on. But the issue is that it's not fully in control everywhere, and there are actions of revenge, either by thugs or by sometimes local communities getting revenge or engaging in clashes with other communities. And this can be difficult at times to control just because there is no manpower. So this is really the main issue that they are facing at the moment, because every single country is judging them based on their ability to maintain at least some internal cohesion. Because other problems, like how they deal with other small armed groups, they can deal with them, those supported by Turkey. The Northeast as well, to a large extent, they will be able to deal with them in the sense that the Northeast, without external support and without ability to provide an alternative to HGS, will also have to be negotiated on a way out to be included in the government. So I'll go quickly also on the second set of questions. The group that have actually taken over, and especially the jihadis, have never received money from foreign countries. Foreign countries like the US have sent hundreds of millions to the opposition, but to the opposition that was willing to fight Jabhat al-Nusra. There was never, ever any Western support for Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, or Islamist groups. Westerners have supported armed groups in Syria, but those armed groups have systematically failed. The American program, which consisted, I think, in at least like $500 million, ultimately only managed to train a few dozen people who never actually fought on the battlefield. So that's one of the paradoxes of the Syrian opposition and what we are seeing at the moment. So in that sense, they can be seen as a proxy, because the group that has succeeded is the one that paradoxically received far less influence from outside, which might also be one of the reasons of its success. Because by not relying on foreign actors for money and for support, it had to rely on itself, it had to become stronger internally, it had to develop its own source of money and so on, which ultimately made it also more efficient on the ground, which I think is an interesting paradox. Then, about their progressive role in Syria, I mean, that's a difficult question. To a large extent, when we speak to Syrians about what has happened in the past in the Idlib province, that was under control of HTS, it was actually more developed than the rest of Syria. Its economy was more advanced. There were development of malls, of restaurants, electricity was more stable, internet was more stable, and so on. So it doesn't mean that it will be applied to all the country, but they have shown some capacity of showing economic resilience, despite the real issue that IHEID mentioned about the persistence of political authoritarianism, which we don't really know to what extent they will be able to open up to new parts of society and being quite more inclusive than they've been until now, because that's a real issue for the group. Yes, they have learned about other experiences. When we've had discussions with them over the years, they always looked at what happened elsewhere. They looked at not just Iraq, but they looked at Iraq, they looked at Libya, they looked at Islamists in Egypt, they looked at Tunisia, to understand also what went wrong in other transitions. And 2003 and 2023 are extremely different. 2003, we speak of a foreign army taking over the country of Iraq and committing two basic mistakes, dismantling the Ba'ath Party and dismantling the army, which paved the way for a new insurgency that destabilized the country and that ended up in a civil war between Sunni and Shia aligned group. This is very different. This is an armed group that basically managed to take over the government or the regime of Assad with very little foreign support, which it did mostly by itself, and it had learned the experience of Iraq in the sense that, for example, there was even a transition of power. The new prime minister took power from the previous prime minister. So they understood that you don't just take over the government. You have the claim of a transition and of a continuation of political authority, precisely to avoid what has happened before. But they're not learning just from Iraq, they're learning also from Libya. When they speak of a new Syrian army, they don't want to have different factions basically contending for power. One, like in Libya, one taking over the security of the airport, one taking the Ministry of Interior, one taking the border, etc. They want all the groups to dismantle and to create a new cohesive army, which some might denounce as a desire to impose their own desire over the army and to totally control it, which is a fair criticism. Or it's also a way to have some cohesive entity as opposed to a plurality of armed groups forming an army but with their own independent center of powers.
Sure. I think just to add to what Jerome said about the group itself and how cohesive it is, I think most of the attention that is given to the group is given to the group right now. But if you go back a year, back, you will see that the group was on the, in my opinion, was about to collapse. There were internal divisions within the group. The part of the group was arresting the other part. I'm talking about quite senior commanders and figures within the group. and that led to defections and led to high tensions between different groups. And that's partially because of ideological differences, but also because of competition for power and influence within the group. So you have people who belong to specific areas in Syria, like the eastern wing, what people refer to as the eastern wing of HTS, those who come from the eastern part of Syria, were competing against those who were referred to as the Idlib wing, and again, those originally from the Idlib area. So you have those people who belong to different areas competing, but also you have the differences which you refer to as one of the threats, as the foreign fighters who still believe in the original sort of goal of the group, which is to establish an Islamic State. But those are not only foreigners. You have many Syrians who also believe the same, and now you hear and see more of those sort of voices getting sort of louder and louder. Some of them are even going to, for example, Christian areas, or even to areas where people are drinking, and those include Sunni Muslims who go there and tell them you should stop the music, you should stop sort of drinking, you should stop doing this and that, you should implement Sharia. And they're preaching as the same way they used to do in 2011 and 12 and 13. So those are just some of the differences within the group itself. When it comes to the threats, I think if you ask the group what the main threats they face are, will be completely different to what someone like me, who has been studying the group for years, would say. For them, there will be the economy, and they have been repeating that will be sanctions, will be issues related to the ability to, for example, reboost the economy, provide electricity, import fuel, and all of those issues, which are important for sure. But there are many threats from within the group itself, and those are threats that the group, at least publicly, does not acknowledge. Whether they acknowledge internally, that's a different story. And those are the divisions between those the hardliners within the group and the pragmatists. And the group right now is just ignoring the hardliners, or trying to send them back to Idlib in order to basically confine them in that area, because generally speaking, the area there is quite conservative. So they will not see the same sort of activities they'd see elsewhere when it comes to drinking, smoking. Maybe smoking you'd see everywhere, but not wearing a veil and all of that. And this is sooner or later the group will have to deal with that. If they use force against those individuals and groups, and I think they are not only individuals, I think they are more than individuals, and they're grouping together. Will they use force against them and risk them defecting and creating their own insurgency against the group, or will they use more sort of pragmatic approach to them by giving them some sort of freedom to do some activities in some areas, but consolidating them or confining them to that area, like in Idlib again? Even if they do that, I don't think it'll be enough. So sooner or later they'll have to deal with that, and how they deal with it, I think, will be crucial. Now, when it comes to what sort of role they will do, I think it depends on what sort of role you're talking about. If you talk about their ability to improve living conditions, they have already done that in a matter of a few weeks. As I said, I was there and came back, and people, when you talk to them and you ask them, how do you see the situation now? The first thing they say is that prices are way lower now than before. Commodities are available, even the ones that are now a bit more expensive than before, like fuel and bread. They say even they are more expensive now, even if they are more expensive now, it's better the situation because those commodities are available. But for me as a Syrian, I don't think that's the only measure you should basically assess their sort of governance model based on, because for me what's more important than which at least equally important, is to be able to have a say in how the country is run and allow people to implement their vision and at least have a say over who rules them and how. And in that sense, the question mark is way bigger than whether they will be able to improve living conditions or not. The last bit, when it comes to Iraq and differences and similarities, Jerome has already mentioned few differences, but I think one of the major ones is that the group itself, when it took over the country, it did not do it alone. Now, again, everyone talks about the offensive that started with them on November 27th, but the group was still occupied in Homs when the rest of the country was liberated by locals from those areas. You talk about Sueda, people from Sueda pushed regime forces out of the governorate. Daraa did the same. And then those, with the help of those from the countryside of Damascus, then also liberated Damascus itself. So by the time Hayat Tahrir al-Sham breached Damascus, the city was already liberated, and they just basically consolidated the security situation there. And this is, I think, one of the differences, that they not only did not use an extensive sort of level of, or excessive level of violence, they assured people there that they can live under their control and they can even participate in the sort of in ruling the country. And I think this has, at least for now, worked, because people, despite questioning how credible that promise is, they're still hopeful that it could be implemented, and they're trying to basically make it work. And the other thing is that Iraq, 6 weeks in after the occupation, the U.S.-led occupation of the whole country was collapsing. Now you go to Damascus again. I was there. I'm not going to keep talking about that, but I was there. I was extremely surprised by how normal life there was. People were like, restaurants are busy, cafes are busy, everyone's basically going to work, and people are just talking. If you would have not known about what happened in early December, you go there, it's like, this is functioning like a normal state. And again, I'm simplifying because there are many challenges there. But as a foreigner, you go there and you just walk around, you will not see that many armed, basically, individuals in the streets. There's only one checkpoint to the airport. You see more checkpoints in Lebanon, in Beirut, than you see in Damascus. So there are many differences there, for sure, when it comes to how it was sort of the situation was changed. Will that last? That's a question I think we'll have to wait to see the answer to. Thank you.
I'll be very quick. Professor, thank you for your question, because I just came back from Iraq, and I spent a few days, about 10 days in Iraq, traveling around and speaking to some Iraqis. They've told me something similar as well, that HTS leaders are agents working for the United States or working for regional powers. And I think it's understandable that some people are quite suspicious of this group. I feel that we all living in an alternate reality to some extent. A Nazi salute is not really a Nazi salute, but a watermelon is actually anti-Semitic. But having said that, I do think, at least when it comes to this group, so far the focus has been on rebuilding Syria. And the situation in Syria is very fragile, so clearly they have to be very careful about what they do, about what they say. And I suppose there are not just internal challenges, but also external challenges, as mentioned earlier, and I completely agree. Internally, perhaps the impression is that top leaders are saying all the right things, but you really don't know what their militants are going to do. And I think the fear in many parts, particularly in the context of Iraq, people were talking about intiqam ta'ifi, revenge killings or sectarian revenge. So clearly that's something to be taken into consideration as well. And externally, there's one thing that perhaps we haven't really mentioned. There are perhaps countries in the region that would not be very happy with an Islamist government. countries like the UAE in particular would not be very happy with having an Islamist government. And I think that certainly is going to be another issue as well, to see what these countries will actually do. So having said that, it's understandable that perhaps there are some people who feel that this group, what's the agenda? And I've heard a lot of that as well from on social media, but also from speaking to people in the region. So I do think, a lot depends on how they perform. A lot depends on whether or not they're going to be able to control internally as well. So just answering that one.
Right, we do 4 more questions.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Harmony Torres from the University of Reading and also a PhD student of Jeroen.
I didn't plan this.
You've taught us all, though. It's good. Jerome, you tell a relatively coherent story, except for the acceleration at the end, right? Where all of a sudden it goes quicker than you expect. But there is a sort of nearly a linearity to the story you tell, and IHEID tells a slightly less coherent. I think the story that you tell is messier. Is there something that surprised you post takeover of Damascus? Something that you didn't expect that HTS did, that you thought that's not what I thought they would do, and what does that tell you about the movement? Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Lena. I'm a postgrad at LSE. I think my question, we've not really discussed it, but as we know, Syria is very ethnically and religiously diverse, and I think one of the strongest, most vocal of its ethnicities is the Kurds, and Rojava has been autonomous since 2012 and has been controlled by Kurdish militia. So I just wanted to kind of ask, do you think there will be any diplomatic relations between HTS and the YPG in Rojava, or will HTS try to reintegrate Rojava into Syria as a whole rather than just autonomous?
So I have 2 comments. Well, the first comment is, when we talk about Islamism, those of us who studied Islamism, if you just focus on their theology, you are going to come across very rigid ideas. Antagonism, rejection of the West, situation among minorities, women, etc. But if you look at them from a social scientific point of view, you are going to come across political actors. And political actors have maneuvers, pragmatism, you call it. They deal with situations as they have to in order to reach their goal. So even Al-Qaeda in the 1980s, when they were fighting the Soviet Union, they accepted bin Laden was sponsored by the US, by Britain, by Saudi Arabia, by the Pakistani intelligence services. So even bin Laden, who's like the devil, was able to work with the West. So the question is, Jolani now, it seems to me he's sort of shifting from the Salafi background, especially during the last 10 years when they were bombarding the world with strong Salafi messages in order to appeal to donors in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Qatar, etc. They may or may not believed in what they were saying at the time, but they did need the money. And many groups did exactly that. Now the criteria is, what is he going to do with the West? So far we've seen that he is pragmatic. He needs Western recognition in order to rebuild Syria. But the question is, what is he going to do with Israel that still occupies part of Syria and is expanding even more and took advantage of the situation in December, and now it's gained more territory. So that's the point that his transitional government will have to deal with, simply because his jamhur, his audience, expect a response to that. So, and the other point is the transitional government now behaving like Ikhwan al-Muslimin rather than a rigid sort of, in inverted comma, political movement, a Salafi political movement? Have they probably followed the path of Nahda in Tunisia? And we all saw what happened to Nahda after like 4 or 5 years of recognition by Western governments, invitations to capitals in Washington and here, etc. The military took over. So I can't see that the Syrian military come back, but somebody from all these other groups that were sponsored, as you said, by the US or somebody else, who's more acceptable as the new face of Syria. Do you see that happening?
And then finally, very short, and also the answer will be very short because we're way over time.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Ahmed, a student of Hochschule Furtwangen in Germany. My question is very simple. So HTS is a designated, or at least it was a designated terrorist organization. Yet we have seen many international figures, like the German foreign minister, for example, engaging in Damascus to normalize relation. So my question is it pragmatism, or is it a hypocrisy, to be honest, or is it maybe a combination of both?
Yeah. Thank you. So I'll try to be concise. Harmony. No, I don't think there's something that's particularly surprising to me, because I mean, we've been interacting with them very closely for the past few years, so we understand how they think, how they've acted. And I mean, what IHEID was saying as well, I mean, basically the same people that were in charge of Idlib are now in charge of the government. As I say, because we need continuity, we need to have cohesion in our decisions, and so on. And the way they behave is the way they were speaking in private before. They used to say, we want strategic relation with Western countries, even though Western countries still list us as a terrorist organization. I mean, that's been an objective for at least 4 or 5 years. So in that sense, them trying to reach out now to Western countries is not that surprising. Similarly, what they do with like religious communities and so on, it's what they've done in Italy. I mean, doesn't mean that situation was perfect. Far from it, there were still constraints on religious communities, but they had reached out to them, they had restored some of their rights, and so on. And religious communities had seen this opening under the HTS governance in Idlib. So now them continuing to reach out to others is not that surprising. Even though, you know, there was a tension, and I mentioned it, you know, you can open up to part of society, doesn't mean that you include them politically. So that is a tension that SIANs themselves will also have to solve. About the question on the Kurds, I mean, ultimately there's a situation in which, you know, YPG, a Kurdish group, is controlling a larger organization, the SDF, that are controlling a big part of Syrian territory. But a larger part of this territory is inhabited also by Arab population that are not Kurdish and that might not accept to continue being under SDF control for the years to come. I mean, there were detentions before the takeover of Damascus, but now many of the populations are saying we want to be also with the government. And that's also part of the discussions that are existing with Western countries and so on. Though I see, HTS does not want to clash with them, but I think ultimately they want to reinclude them within the army. So now there are discussions about it. There are special envoys from the SDF speaking to Ahmed Ashara, to the new leadership, about basically it's more about the conditions in which their military forces can be integrated. They want to integrate as a bloc, like the Peshmerga did in Iraq, which HTS can't really accept because they think, well, would we have an independent bloc within our army? But I think that ultimately we'll have to find a solution because the SDF cannot continue as an organization the way it has for the past few years. Yes, Madawi, I agree with you. And for me, that's an issue when we study jihadis. If we start with their theology, saying, for example, IS is radical because they have this reading of medieval theology, that doesn't explain why another group can also use the same sources but in very different manner. That's why for me, ideas can matter, but it's more about the context in which you understand those ideas. For example, what Rahan was mentioning about the book and the framework, one of my issues is when people say HTS is radical because that's the way they read theology. I think they see it the other way around. For me, IS was in factional fight with other factions with very similar ideas. So for them, the only solution was basically to say, we are the only one legitimate. So then you justify it with your theology to legitimize the fact that you're fighting people who have more or less the same ideas that you proclaim to believe in. So yeah, it matters more as a justification than really a cause of conflict among them. So there were a few questions about the West. So what I was mentioning to Harmony, they wanted to reach out to the West for a very long time, which is still very different from other Al-Qaeda organizations. Because even bin Laden was I mean, not supported directly by Western countries. Western countries are supporting other factions of the Afghan resistance. And, you know, the Arabs were not directly supported by them. But even that, in the 90s, his position was much clearer, and the positions of other Al-Qaeda affiliates now has been much clearer. For him, it's clear that the context of Syria means you need to find different types of alliances, and you have to balance those alliances. So that includes allying with Western countries, with Turkey, and potentially also play the Russian card, potentially if it can help you achieve more things with Western countries by saying, no, we have alternatives. Regarding Israel, they can't launch war at Israel. No, many have criticized them and saying, you're very lenient towards Israel, and Israel has been attacking you. But what do we expect from them? We expect them to open a new front after what they've seen, what Israel has done to Lebanon and Syria and Gaza. Syria has been at war for 15 years. They can't allow themselves to enter a new war. So for them, the only way was to go through the diplomatic solution, to raise the campaign at the UN, even though, you know, the UN is not something that they believed in before, but because they don't have any alternatives to that. Because if we were in their position, we would be doing exactly the same thing. You can complain publicly, but you can't do much else. And basically, yes, they are becoming more like the MB without being Muslim Brotherhood, just because that's the position that structurally they are starting to occupy. So it's different from the MB, though, including in Egypt and Tunisia, is that for me, I don't think there is any other power that can counterbalance them. Even those other armed groups are still much weaker than them. They don't have the same cohesion and ability to resist. At the same time, they still have to learn from what happens elsewhere, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, and that we're going to see with what happened with the constitution. When there's going to be a new constitution, what will be the role of, like, religion, for example? Are they going to commit the same mistake as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in saying now we have the majority so we can impose our view because we make concession to Salafis and so on, even though a big part of society is much more diverse than them, and even though the Muslims don't necessarily agree with their views either. So what happened with the constitution will be very important. And that links to the idea of the national dialogue, who is included, how they are selected. I mean, this is the whole issue. Do they want to use their power now to impose a constitution that really put them in charge for a very long time, or can they also make some concessions? And objectively, it's extremely hard to know, because I'm not even sure whether they know fully how they're going to do it. What is clear, I think, is that politically they still want to maintain some control. So they want to maintain control over the army, internal security services, the economy, foreign affairs, and then they can delegate many other things, which is what they've done in Idlib. They have delegated a lot of their governance in Idlib because they understood that what matters is only a limited part of governance matters, the more important prerogative. You don't have to control everything else. But that remains a question about, you know, exactly what happened in terms of inclusion in the constitution. About HTS being listed, the thing is, we've worked on that quite a lot. The listing at the UN Security Council under the 1267 sanction regime means that those members of listed groups can't travel and you can't give them money. But you can still speak to them. And so that's the position of these countries. They just have to be pragmatic. Ultimately, the group has taken over the country. It's trying to reach out. So what you do, you act as a diplomat. So you have to speak to them. Is it hypocritical? A big part of politics is also hypocrisy. You know, you have ideas, but then you also implement them in different ways because your interests are changing. And basically, what happened for the past 5 years when HTS was in charge, HTS paradoxically had given to Western countries, but for their own interest, what Western countries expected. They stabilized the situation in northwest Syria, which meant that there were no more refugees going to Turkey, and they contained transnational threats. So they clamped down on Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And the issue of HTS before taking over Damascus is basically they had offered Western countries everything that Western countries expected from them. So there was no incentive at the time for Western countries to speak to them, because HTS no longer had anything to offer to them, which was really the dilemma in which HTS was before taking over Damascus. But now that they've taken control of the government, there is a lot to actually do. So Western countries had to change position just because you recognize the reality that's in front of you. You don't have to like it, it's just there. And what Rehan was mentioning about the Emiratis, I mean, that's a real role, but there is also the perception of other countries in the region, like Jordan and Egypt, in the sense that if there is somehow relatively successful or not, I mean, we'll see, but if somehow the experiment ends up in an acceptable manner, that's also a threat to countries like Jordan and Egypt, because it means that some Islamist movements can also succeed in power, which has never really happened before, which could, weaken them in a way domestically vis-à-vis their own Islamist opposition movement.
Oh, I'll probably just add a little bit as well, but very briefly. I think with the US working or accepting or trying to just assess the situation by working with HDS, as you said, we've been working behind closed doors even before. But perhaps is, when you look at the Syrian regime, so clearly the enemy is worse, particularly for the United States. They're part of the axis of resistance. So it's much easier to work with a group like HDS than working with a group or working with a government that's very much affiliated with all of their enemies like Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, Iran, and so on. So I do think there's also that pragmatic, I'm using the word pragmatic a lot, but there's also this realistic element, and the United States trying to preserve its national interests as well.
Yeah, quickly, a few notes. The first one related to what was surprising and what explains what happened so quickly. I think the group itself was surprised by how easy it was to not only advance and capture Aleppo, but then go all the way to Damascus. Their main objective at the time was to capture, the ultimate goal was Aleppo, the city. They were not even dreaming of going all the way to Damascus, despite what they're saying right now. And when they were surprised by how easy it was, then their objectives changed, and then they started heading towards Damascus. What allowed that collapse and what explains that? There are many things. One of them, they've become more organized, better equipped. Then also the regional as well as international allies have been busy elsewhere. You talk about Russia and Ukraine, you talk about Hezbollah and Iran. They're busy with their own things, and they did not provide support to the regime. You also see regime fighters, they were not willing to fight. They were exhausted, they were not paid well, and they did not want to basically fight for the regime that, despite them fighting for before and allowing it to maintain in power, ignored them and marginalized them and did not even provide them with the essential essential services and allowed them to make a living. So there are many things that explain what happened, but I think they were initially the big surprise is how quickly the regime was defeated. When it comes to HTS and SDF, I agree with what Jerome said, and there are negotiations happening right now. However, I really cannot see how their zero-sum sort of position will be able to meet in the middle. That with SDF or with the Syrian Democratic Forces, it's not only the security and military structures that they have created, and they want to keep them, but also they want to keep their governance models and structures. Despite operating under the umbrella of the Damascus and the sort of the Syrian flag, but they want to keep what they have created, and that's the HTS and the whatever transitional authorities in Damascus will unlikely accept that. What does that mean? They will most likely not enter a fight right now, because it will also depend on how the US will sort of approach the situation, whether they will withdraw from Northeast or not, whether they will try to pressure the SDF to reach an agreement or not, and what sort of cards HTS can play in order to allow them to go and take over that area even by force if needed, especially with regard to how to deal with the fight of ISIS and ISIS detainees, including foreigners there. Now, when it comes to Israel, yeah, the group has been clear. They are not going to fight Israel. They're not going to do anything about it, and they will basically resort to diplomatic sort of channels in order to solve that. But as you mentioned, that is upsetting not only their own sort of followers, but Syrians in general, because this is not acceptable, and we have already seen at least one demonstration taking place asking the group to attack Israel and fight back. Most likely that sentiment will continue to increase, and unless Israel withdraws from the areas they recently occupied inside Syria, I think the situation will get worse. And even if the group does not want to fight, that their ability to control others from fighting back, I think will be questionable here. The last bit, when it comes to who will replace them, are we looking at another group to replace them or not? I think a lot, again, depends on what happens, because the group itself, even in the way they are talking about the transition and the future of the country, they are not saying that we will control it. They're saying that we will allow people to create technical committees to then decide how the group will be run. There will be elections, all of those. So if actually they implement what they're saying, then that would be like any other sort of democracy, where they might win at times and they might lose at times. But if they will accept that, then you will definitely see different faces there. My assumption is that it's unlikely that they will allow that to happen, and most likely what they will do is what many suspect, that they will try to use different sorts of tactics in order to give the impression that people are sort of choosing them to maintain power, and then using behind sort of under the table different mechanisms in order to ensure that their power is consolidated for a long time. But this cannot be sort of implemented the way they imagine it to be implemented, because those decisions, despite how smart they think they are doing things, people can easily tell what's happening, whether those are announced or not. And sooner or later, they'll have to make a decision whether they actually go behind what they're saying and fulfill those promises, or continue to operate the same model they operated in Idlib and face the consequences. And those consequences are not only external. You have many Syrians who say that we will not accept any group to basically impose its vision on the country and control us the same way the regime used to control us. So there will be consequences, mostly in domestic consequences rather than external consequences. Thank you.
All that's left then is thank to Jerome and to the discussants, and to the audience for very good questions and for staying with us until past 7:30.